Ukraine is a tech-savvy nation. Its citizens have turned every cell phone into a news source and every social media app into a strategic tool of war.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought forth a new dimension to conflict. While wars of information have long existed, this is the first large-scale conflict where platforms are important actors. Leaders are communicating to citizens and to the entire world online. Competing accounts of events are uploaded and shared, and the actions of the companies that are the backbone of this new digital front are under intense scrutiny. Platforms like Google, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook operate within both Russia and Ukraine, with state leaders using these platforms to share information. As the conflict intensified, platforms were challenged on whether it was ethical to continue to operate within Russia and profit from the spread of misinformation about the conflict. Initially, platforms were hesitant to limit their reach, with companies like Meta claiming it was important for the world to hear what Russian leaders were saying. But under pressure from Ukraine and under the weight of sanctions from other nations, platforms began to take action. Russia then retaliated by blocking Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter within its borders. The citizens of Russia are now caught in the middle. Russian creators who need platform profits for income are not able to make money, and all Russians are now only able to access information put out by state channels and are no longer getting information from outside sources.
Media studies scholar Robert McChesney helped shape our understanding of the political economy of communications, which examines the intertwinement of media within our social, political, and economic spheres. The sweeping shutdowns of digital platforms across Russia have highlighted the interplay of these forces. For example, since media and platform ownership is largely concentrated in the United States, Western-centric values and ideologies are dominating the conversation around the digital blockade. It seems likely that we are at what both McChesney and Cernick referred to as a critical juncture in the role platforms play in society. The major platforms are under intense pressure to act in this conflict. By doing so, they are reprioritizing corporate goals away from advertising gains and towards social capital gains, as dictated by users' moral expectations. Conversations around platform power typically go hand in hand with free speech and freedom of expression. It's interesting that the free speech-obsessed West has taken the stance that restricting or filtering Russian voices is the morally right thing to do. This will likely change the conversation of free speech rights once the dust settles.
Canadian sanctions on Russia are imposed under the Special Economic Measures Act. Some of these sanctions target members of the Russian media. Actions towards these individuals through sanctions and pressure on platforms limits how Russians and Canadians who follow these outlets access information. It is in essence censoring these voices. These actions raise questions about the limits of government power. Should government be able to silence select media voices inside and outside its borders? While there is relative global agreement that it's justified in this case, that may not always be true and is subject to government judgment. Is this democratic? There's also the other side, the risks to letting these voices spread. Up until this crisis, the Canadian government has been unable to stop misinformation from spreading, including content spread by Russia and Russian media personalities. What impact does this also have on how governments manage the monopolistic tendencies of large platforms? This conflict is an example of how U.S. firms hold incredible geopolitical influence. They can, in essence, stop the flow of information in and out of an identified country. If these companies were more fractured, that wouldn't be possible.
The big question, from a policy perspective, is whether or not platforms should even have the power to plunge the largest country on Earth into digital darkness. If the answer is no, then it's safe to say that American antitrust laws have failed at reining in monopolistic growth, which has allowed platform power to balloon to the status of weaponized nations. To date, we have largely allowed platforms to self-regulate by establishing their own policies and guidelines to adhere to in good faith. Perhaps the most egregious violation of this is Meta's decision to temporarily lift its ban on hate speech and calls of violence directed at Russian soldiers on both Facebook and Instagram. Content moderators responsible for upholding and enforcing these policies now find themselves in the position of making judgment calls that are literally life or death. While many countries are starting to wake up to the need to regulate digital platforms, such as Canada's Online Streaming Act and Germany's Network Enforcement Act, these laws only apply within that country's geographic borders. What this multinational conflict has demonstrated is the need for multinational oversight. For example, a regulatory board composed of technical experts, lawmakers, and human rights activists with representatives from multiple countries. Ultimately, the goal of any policy or regulatory action should be to protect citizens of our global online community and advocate for our vulnerable populations. While the West was quick to advocate its support of Ukraine, innocent Russian civilians are experiencing firsthand that empowering the voices of some ultimately silences the voices of others.